Good morning to all my friends and family, and welcome to this episode of Jim's 5am Club. Today I come to you from the magnificent grounds of Sydney University, and what I'd love to do is to go through a book, and the book that I've selected for today's episode is entitled Everything is Obvious, a book that was published on the 26th of June 2012 by an author named Duncan and is a provocative dismantling of common sense reasoning and why it often leads us astray. A sociologist and network science pioneer, Watts argues that what seems obvious in hindsight is rarely predictable in advance, and that our reliance on narratives, intuition, and expert predictions actually blinds us to the complexities of life. And this book happens to be a call for humility in a world obsessed with simple explanations, but a world that doesn't really understand that we are surrounded by complexity, ambiguity, and many big challenges. So the first key message to come from this author is where he talks about a thing called the hindsight bias trap. So to put this into perspective, the hindsight bias trap talks about that after an event, many people, including ourselves, often convince ourselves that it was predictable. Of course, that startup failed. It had to fail. The second point that the author makes here is that common sense does not necessarily equate to common truth. What feels intuitively correct, for example, hard work guarantees success, often ignores randomness and systemic forces. Now, you can work hard all your life, but doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to be successful, because there's a few other things that need to happen. There's a few other things that have to align. Some people are lucky, some people are smart, and some people are unlucky, and things don't necessarily go their way for whatever reason. Now, we've got to also understand that fate has a part to play as well. Just because it worked for your father, your mother, or somebody else doesn't mean that if you follow the same formula, it's going to work for you. And conversely, just because it didn't work for somebody else doesn't mean it's not going to work for you. So we need to understand that life isn't fair and things don't always work out according to plan. The author here also highlights a thing called the myth of the lone genius. Breakthroughs like iPhones and smartphones didn't just happen because somebody invented it and decided from scratch this is how it's going to work. It depends on networks and timing, not just individual brilliance. most inventions in the world are continuations of inventions that other people have made, and it's an incremental process rather than a full step function. So it's more sequential and incremental rather than somebody taking an almighty leap and inventing something. The next point that the author makes here is that even experts get it wrong, and we see it time and time again. Overconfidence in patterns leads to false predictions. We see it all the time in the share market, we see it in the polls for elections, and we see it in life. Whilst it's important to be able to recognise patterns and trends and to try and anticipate it, things don't normally or don't always work out exactly how you expect them to work out. And for this reason, experts don't always get it right. We see with the weather. We see the weatherman or the weatherwoman always saying it's going to be this, that and the other, and you turn up without your umbrella and it's absolutely pouring. So even experts get it wrong. Another point that the author makes here is an interesting one, where he says there's an effect called the rich get richer. And he explains here that success is often about cumulative advantage, which I meant about and talked about before. It's based on a bit of luck and a bit of initial edge, not just merit. So for that reason, it is important. Now, if you've got an edge, if you've got prime mover advantage, to try and make the most of it, because it is a significant advantage if you capitalise on it. But if you squander it and waste it, then it's something that's going to bite you in the bum at some point later on. The author here talks about a thing called social contagion. Trends, memes, and riots spread not because they're good, but due to the network dynamics. It just happens, just comes together. Another point to come from this book is the problem with just so stories. Post hoc explanations such as Blockbuster failed because it ignored Netflix usually, if not always, oversimplify causality. There's a lot more to it than what meets the eye, and oversimplifying things really doesn't give it justice, and it is a bit of an insult to the people who are caught up in a particular frenzy of activity. Regardless of what you do, sometimes you just can't save something, and you can't foresee something happening, because, as we said, life is complex and life is complicated, and God has different plans for different people as we learn, as we get older in our lives. But one of the best points to come from this book is that experiments always beat opinions. If you want to really know what works, you've got to test it. Because A leading to B tests always outgun executive hunches. So you need to experiment rather than to opinionate is the key message. Another point that the author makes here is that we look at the wisdom of crowds, and that this wisdom of crowds has its inherent limits. Crowds are usually only as wise as they can be under certain specific conditions. You need to have a certain level of diversity and independence, rather than to have one or two loud and powerful voices who stimulate and manipulate the group think. So we need to understand that crowds can be smart or can be dumb. It all depends on the leadership and what's available to them. And the last key point to come from this book is that we need to embrace uncertainty. In complex systems, humility and adaptability beat false certainty. And what's work is a vaccine against overconfidence. By questioning obvious truths and embracing complexity, we make better decisions in business, policy, and life. Bye for now.